In this video, we're going to work some more examples for graphing tangent, but I do want to finish that last example. I didn't quite get to calculate the period, so let's go ahead and calculate the period for that last example we did on the previous video. So the period, when we calculate period, we use B. B is located up here. And remember, I like to use the Greek letter tau for my period. That's what I learned in high school. So when we calculate period, it's not going to be 2 pi over b, it is going to be pi over b. So my period here should be pi over 2. So if I calculate the width of one of these, the width between my asymptotes, okay, how do I calculate that? I take my ending point and subtract my beginning point. Pi over 4 minus a negative pi over 4, which gives me 2 pi over 4 equals pi over 2, and you notice that equals my period. All right, so let's go ahead and move on to the next example. The next example looks like it has a stretch. All right, so let's go ahead and locate our A, B, and C. A, B, C, and D. And what does A equal? A is the number in front of tangent, so A is going to be -3. B is the number in front of X, so that's going to be 1/3. C is our vertical shift, and we have none. And D is our horizontal shift or phase shift, and we have none. All right, so it looks like we're going to stretch this graph by 3, but also we have a negative, and we know that when we have a negative, when we multiply a negative, that also is a reflect across the x-axis, across x-axis. Okay, so not only do we have a stretch of 3, but we have a reflect across the x-axis. So we have identified that. Now let's go ahead and find our beginning and our ending points. Our beginning, remember, we take everything that we're taking the tangent of, so 1/3 x, and we set it equal to negative pi over 2 for our beginning. And when we multiply by 3, we get x equals negative 3 pi over 2. And for our ending point, we do the same thing, except now we set it equal to pi over 2. So when we multiply by 3, we get 3 pi over 2. So really all I need to do is I need to make sure that between this and this, I have 4 equal parts. So let's go ahead and set up, I really don't need to count by 2's. I can just, like pi over 2's, like I don't need to say negative pi over 2, negative pi, I don't need to do this, okay, because that just wouldn't give me enough for another period. So what I am going to do is I'm just going to mark it like I did on the last one, negative 3 pi over 2 and positive 3 pi over 2. Okay, I'm going to mark off 1, 2, 3, 4. Oh, well, let's go ahead and draw our asymptotes for our beginning and our end and label those. This is going to be x equals negative 3 pi over 2, x equals 3 pi over 2. I can mark off another period if I count 4. What is that label going to be? I don't know yet, because I don't know what each label, like each of these large increments, is going to be yet. I know this middle point is 0, but what's this point in between? Well, let's find the midpoint here. So if I say 3 pi over 2 plus 0 and then divide that by 2, I get 3 pi over 4, so that's the midpoint here. So every mark is going to be 3 pi over 4 distance, right? 3 pi over 4, 6 pi over 4, 9 pi over 4, 12 pi over 4 reduces to 3 pi, 15 pi over 4, 30 pi over 4 reduces to 15 pi over 2. So that's going to be the label there. I know that's an asymptote, so I should label it. And if I count backwards by 3 pi over 4, I just get those. So those are going to be my 2 periods I'm going to go ahead and graph. All right, so we need to calculate these little quarter and halfway marks. So let's go ahead and do our calculations. The tangent of 1/3 times -3 pi over 4, and then we're going to multiply that by a -3. So this reduces out. That's negative pi over 4. I know that's going to equal -1. So my graph starts high here, up at 3. Let's label that 3, and this is going to be -3. All right, so now we have -3 times the tangent of 1/3 times 0. I know that's the tangent of 0 is just 0, so I'm going to get 0 there. I also know -3 tangent of 1/3 times 3 pi over 4. The 3's reduce out. That's pi over 4. That's 1. Tangent of pi over 4 is 1 times -3 is -3. So my graph is going to look a little different than the graph before. It's almost going to look like, oh, that's a horrible, 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 horrible graph. Don't draw your graphs like that. Okay, I know it's gotta, it's gonna approach, right? Gonna draw a nice straight line here, but it's gonna curve in this way and then curve up this way. It's not quite a straight line if we keep graphing. So I'm going to go ahead and plot the same points over here. Hopefully I will get a better graph. You'll see it curve and you'll see it curve. I had to take it off of my graph paper just so that I could see the curve in my graph because it's not a straight line. Okay, let's do this one last example here and we'll be done. Okay, so here we have A, B, and C. A, B, I don't know why that erased, B, C, and D. Our A value, the number in front of tangent, is 2/3. That means we're going to be compressing it. Our A value is less than 1, so it's a compress. Our B value, well, what do we notice about our B value? It hasn't been factored out, so maybe we should go ahead and rewrite this as 3/4 times x minus 4/3 pi. Okay, if I distribute that 3/4 across, I get that negative pi that you see right here. All right, so my B value is going to be 3/4. My C value is going to be -2, so we're moving our graph down. And our D value, or our phase shift, is going to be 4 pi over 3. So I have a period. Let's calculate our period. Tau is going to be pi over B, which is 3/4, is going to be 4 pi over 3. So that's my period. My phase shift, I'm moving my graph to the right by 4 pi over 3. I have a vertical shift of -2, meaning I'm moving my graph down. Okay. And then I have a compress factor. I am compressing my graph by 2/3. Okay, so my compress factor is 2/3. So let's go ahead and find the beginning and the end of this. So I'm going to set what's in parentheses for the beginning. 3/4 x minus pi equals -pi over 2. So when I add a pi to both sides, I get pi over 2, and then when I multiply by 4/3, I get 2 pi over 3. My end is going to be the same, except I'm setting that equal to pi over 2. When I add pi, I get 3 pi over 2. That's a 3/4, sorry. And then when I multiply by 4/3, I'm going to get 2 pi. Okay, so now let's go ahead and mark off on our graph. Let's see, I have a beginning of 2 pi over 3. If I count by 2 pi over 3, where will I end? 2 pi over 3 plus 2 pi over 3 equals 4 pi over 3 plus 2 pi over 3 equals 6 pi over 3, which is 2 pi. So I know I can count by 2/3 pi and get to the end if I want to. Let's see how that looks on my graph. So if I label this 2 pi over 3, 4 pi over 3, 6 pi over 3, which is 2 pi. I don't really like how that looks on my graph. I have to split this period into 4 equal parts, which really crunches it. And I could do it, but I'd rather stretch it out. So I'm going to go ahead and stretch it out a bit because I like to be able to see what I'm doing. So I'm going to do pi over 3 instead of 2 pi over 3 intervals. Pi, 4 pi over 3, 5 pi over 3, and then 6 pi over 3 or 2 pi. I know I'm going to have asymptotes at x equals 2 pi over 3 and 2 pi. And I know I'm going to have a nice vertical shift at -2. So I'm going to mark that on my graph so I don't forget it, because I forget things like that. Okay, so I need to count backwards. I have 1, 2, 3, 4. So I'm going to count backwards. 1, 2, 3, 4. This is -pi over 3, and this is -2 pi over 3. And I'm going to mark a nice asymptote there for my second period. Okay, so now I just have to do some quick calculations. Tangent of 3/4 pi minus pi. Okay, and I'm going to multiply that by 2/3, and then I'm going to subtract 2 from that. So what do I get here? I get -pi over 4. Tangent of -pi over 4 is -1, so that's a -2/3. And then when I subtract 2, I get a -2 2/3. At 4 pi over 3, tangent of 3/4 times 4 pi over 3 minus pi. That, they're just going to cross off. Pi minus pi is 0. Tangent at 0 is 0. So I just get a -2. And then I need my last quartile mark. Tangent 2/3 tangent of 5 pi over 3. So 3/4 times 5 pi over 3 minus pi. That cancels out. 5/4 minus 1 is 1/4. Tangent of pi over 4 is 1. So now I have -2 plus 2/3. -2, I'm going to add 2/3. It'll be here. So my graph is going to look like this. So now I'm just going to move these points over. So they mirror each other. And if I check the width of each of these, let's check and make sure. 2 pi minus 2 pi over 3 equals, this is really 6 pi over 3. So I get a 4 pi over 3, which is my period, and that is the end of my last example.